Iran's new Supreme Leader Mustafa Khamenei has threatened never-ending revenge for Iranians killed in the war, including 165 people who died in a strike at an elementary school on the first day of fighting.
Most were children. The U.S. military says the strike is still under investigation. But U.S. media, citing officials, reported American forces were likely responsible for hitting the school. Preliminary findings reportedly suggest Washington used outdated intelligence data.
Democrats in the U.S. Senate are pressing for answers over the incident in a letter to the Pentagon. They've asked if it will be investigated as a war crime and what guardrails Washington is taking to limit civilian casualties.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth earlier stressed that Iran is the only side that targets civilians. The strike, if confirmed to be at the hands of the U.S., would stand among the highest civilian casualty events caused by the American military in operations in the last 2 decades.
Well, for more, we're joined by Rachel VanLandingham. She's an Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School. She's also a former Air Force military attorney. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. So, U.S. saying that it is investigating the incident, but in a case like this, what would a credible and transparent investigation look like? And should the findings be made public?
First of all, thank you for having me. And yes, the findings should be made public in order for it to restore credibility and to provide transparency, and not just the results of the report, but the lessons learned taken from this report to institutionalize safeguards. A transparent and credible investigation is going to take some time, but it rests on access. Those investigators need to have access to every step of the targeting process and access to the individuals who were making the decisions whether or not to update, for example, a no-strike list or fail to update it, and where the decision was to rely on almost 10-year-old intelligence data. So a fair investigation needs to have experts, targeteers, and intelligence analysts who do this kind of job every day, who are very familiar with the processes and understand what should have happened. And then once that report is compiled, there needs to be lessons learned, and there need to be institutionalized changes made, and those released to the American people in order to restore our faith that we're not going to go around and kill little children anymore.
Professor, you just mentioned it, but the term that stands out to me in particular is the word outdated targeting. I don't know whether you've actually dealt with it in your time as a military attorney, but did you come across it? Is it something that occurs very often?
No, this is actually shocking. If there was intelligence that was almost 9 to 10 years old that was actually relied on, it's completely inexcusable. I do not find this to be a war crime, because the only time that this would be a war crime is if we knew that the United States knew that that was a children at school and targeted it anyway. And I do not see any evidence that actually occurred. But this is still a crime. It's a crime under U.S. military law, because if there was negligence or recklessness involved, someone didn't do their job to rely on almost a decade-year-old data. This was not dynamic targeting in the middle of a firefight. These were pre-planned targets. And in addition to a pre-planned target, should not rely on almost 10-year-old data. There are things called no-strike lists. These no-strike lists include hospitals, schools, mosques, areas of important heritage, cultural heritage of that country, because those are civilian targets, civilian objects, and they receive extra protection because of their significance to that civilian society. So the fact that this school wasn't on a no-strike list, in addition to if it wasn't, because if it was, then there should have been red flags that have gone up. The problem here is this administration has gutted the civilian harm mitigation and response program that was stood up after the terrible Kunduz strike that killed Medicine Sans Frontiers medical workers and patients in Afghanistan in 2015, and after numerous strikes in places like Syria that killed civilians. The American military can do better, and it's inexcusable that it didn't do better. And the American people, through the representatives in Congress, are demanding a full and fair investigation and the results from that investigation. This was inexcusable.
Professor, you said someone didn't do his or her job. So I take it you think this is human error and not something caused by the more recent use of new technology like AI?
Well, the United States military commanders still have a responsibility to ensure they are targeting military objectives. You cannot offshore the responsibility for lawful targeting to AI. So if you're using AI, you have to ensure it has the safeguards such as using updated intelligence. I would think AI would help us to be able to ensure that we're using intelligence that's not 9 years old. And so, yes, I absolutely do think that there was human error. In every single incident of civilian harm and collateral damage that I've ever seen in the United States military, there is always a human error involved. And I don't think this is any different.
All right, Professor. So even if it turns out to be a mistake, that raises a bigger legal question. What separates tragic collateral damage, as you mentioned, from a prosecutable war crime? What sort of specific facts would you need to see before making that call?
The only thing that would make this a war crime would be actual intent, that the U.S. military knew this was a girls' school and targeted intentionally anyway. If there was carelessness involved, some kind of recklessness or negligence in which there was a mistake made, that does not make this a war crime. That makes this a tragedy, and it could also make it a crime under U.S. domestic military law, because the U.S. military is not supposed to tolerate carelessness in the employment of lethal force. But a war crime would have to have been intentional targeting. There could have also been the scenario in which a commander knew that was the girls' school is next door and decided that the military objective, the advantage gained, far outweighed the civilian loss, and that would have been a proportionality analysis. And one can question whether or not the advantage gained was sufficient to offset the civilian deaths. But what we don't know yet. So we don't. But it looks like this folks didn't know. And therefore that there was carelessness, there was some negligence involved, failure to take precautions in attack to ensure that this kind of thing didn't happen, a failure to put this on a no-strike list. Again, that does not make it a war crime because there was no intentional targeting of a civilian object. However, it can make it a U.S. military crime because there could have been reckless or negligent killing.
And I just want to put this out there. Could the U.S. military argue that Iran should not have repurposed, part of a military headquarters as a school, i.e. the human shield argument?
They can argue it all day long, but that does not absolve the United States as well as Israel from its responsibility to ensure it's only targeting lawful military objectives. And a civilian school occupied by little girls and their civilian teachers is never going to be a legitimate military target. It may be collateral damage, but it's never a legitimate military target. So the enemy's abuse of the law does not absolve the United States of its own legal obligations. And at the end of the day, the United States doesn't want it to. So the United States is going to face a strategic setback if it looks like it is not taking due care to minimize the effect, the tragic effect of warfare on the civilians. The United States is not supposed to be fighting the Iranian people. It's fighting the Iranian regime. And the law of war, which the United States professes fidelity to and usually tries its utmost to adhere to, requires that civilians be protected as much as possible, and then we go after the military targets. There was some kind of institutional breakdown here. And I have faith that the United States military is investigating it right now. I do not have faith that Secretary Hegseth is going to actually restore the processes needed to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again, because he has gutted the institution, the Center of Excellence that was stood up to prevent this kind of tragedy. So unless he restores that and starts providing actual support to minimizing the effect on civilians, I fear that we're going to see something else like this in the ensuing weeks.
We certainly hope not. But if this strike ultimately proves unlawful, Professor, what sort of accountability mechanisms realistically exist right now? And who would have the power to hold anyone accountable here?
Well, there's no international institution that could hold the United States to account. Neither the United States nor Iran nor Israel are parties to the International Criminal Court. So really accountability comes from within the United States military. The United States military is typically very loath to provide any kind of criminal accountability for negligent or reckless mistakes taken during war. Even though we have the ability to, the law is there, but there hasn't been a will to do that. What I do hope to see will be institutionalized process changes, because the process changes will provide greater safeguards. So, but regarding accountability, I highly doubt there will be any.
Professor, you've talked about the Secretary of Defense. I want to ask you about the president now. He has already tried to sidestep blame. I'm wondering if that could, complicate the whole process of the investigation. I mean, will investigators feel uneasy about, going about their work and their probe?
Well, the investigators, as military officers, swear an oath to the Constitution, not to the president, and so I would hope they would remain unbiased. And the investigators, as part of the U.S. military, have an obligation to ensure this is done right, because the U.S. military does not want to be known as baby killers, as killers of little girls. The United States military has honor and has sworn an oath to the Constitution and to uphold the law, and the law of war is part of how the United States military fights. It makes mistakes, which is why the civilian mitigation and harm reduction program was supposed to help mitigate and minimize those kind of mistakes. But I believe that the U.S. military wants to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. So they have their own pragmatic incentive, because when you kill civilians, you lose strategic, you provide propaganda fodder to the enemy, because they make it look like, well, they really do hate us, come join our fight. So it's not helpful pragmatically, it's not helpful morally, and it's not helpful lawfully either. And so I think there's internal incentives, regardless of what the commander-in-chief says. There are internal incentives for the U.S. military to do a full and fair investigation and to put in place processes to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. And so I think the U.S. military, regardless of Secretary Hegseth, regardless of President Trump, the U.S. military internally has a fidelity and has shown a fidelity to the law of war, and they will try to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Even if there isn't accountability, there will be process changes.
Okay, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Rachel VanLandingham, Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School.